right. Well then, without further ado, Jane will present on awkward coffee dates.
Woo! Thanks.
Ready?
I'm ready. So I wanted to do a little departure from the ordinary themes of Synopsis and talk about my history of loving and losing God. So it's a little bit more of a personal story than usual. The reason it's called Awkward Coffee Dates is because I sometimes in the last 7 or 8 years have introduced myself and talked about God being my ex-husband, and occasionally we go on an awkward coffee date to remind ourselves why it's a great thing that we split up. So how did I get here? Well, when I was a little kid, that's me. Yeah. I was unchurched. My mom was a lapsed Catholic, dad was a lapsed Unitarian, if such a thing can be said to exist. But when I was about 10, my mom decided that it was time to go back to the Catholic Church. She wanted us to be raised with some form of faith. So I was baptized in this lovely place in San Diego right here. And I was a pretty obedient and biddable kid, so I kind of believed what I was told and didn't really get serious about faith until I was 16, when I ran across this book on my mom's bookshelf. I still have it somewhere in the house. That this priest talked about making a total commitment to God and using every minute and every action as a way to serve God and bring about social justice. He talked about concern for the poor, and I felt very implicated and called by that, and prayed and cried and decided, okay, yes, I'm going to dedicate my life to God in this way. So that's kind of the first theme, I guess, of my relationship with God, or my history with God, is this idea of perfectionism and making a total commitment and spending every minute living out my faith. Doesn't sound super healthy, does it? When I was in college, I met this guy when I studied abroad in Spain, and he, despite being a very profound atheist, believed that education was the quickest and most effective way to bring about lasting social change and social justice. So when I got home from Spain, I became a tutor to a 7th grade girl who had a lot of personal and academic challenges, and spent 8 to 10 hours a week with her. And I felt so close to God and so connected to God in this work that I was doing with her, that I used to take my key to the church and I'd actually run to the church after tutoring to go and pray. So it was a very meaningful experience. After college, I joined an organization called the Jesuit Volunteers. Should be popping up any second now. And I had this moment, kind of this revelatory moment during that year, where I realized, oh my gosh, I could fall in love with God. This could be my life. And so I started looking into becoming a nun. I actually visited several different orders and did a bunch of exploration of that. So the other kind of, or another theme of my experience of God was this idea of unconditional love. Something that I didn't really experience very deeply as a child, and so it was something that I found in this relationship with God very profound and meaningful, and also kind of uncomfortable and difficult to deal with, but it was something that was really important in my relationship with God. So what happened? Well, in 2007, my mom died. She had breast cancer. She was diagnosed in 2001, and I was 25, which is a bad age to lose your parent. And so in the aftermath of that, I really had to question, well, okay, so I used to believe that God had my back, and I used to believe that things happen for a reason, and all things work together for good, and all of that, right? And I just didn't, the idea that somebody I loved could actually die didn't fit in that conception of faith that I had at that time. And so eventually I kind of just had to let go of that and say, well, I'm living in circumstances that clearly don't align with this thing that I used to believe. So I was pretty unhappy about that. Losing God was kind of like losing my purpose, losing the center of my life, losing a husband, right? Like a divorce. And so I was very unhappy about that at first. And then over time kind of realized the ways in which it was maybe healthier that I was now not a believer anymore. And there were things that I was doing with myself that maybe weren't as productive when I was a believer. But I think that kind of leaves me with the final theme that I'm sort of questioning. What was that, right? So I spent 10 years being in love with an invisible person. And so what is that? Was that a part of myself that I needed to externalize in order to get in touch with that sort of creative state. Was that something that in some way was objectively real, and I just didn't, I don't know, it's something I still think about and still question. Thanks. Yes.
A question about your, like, a couple of the themes that you talked about when you were starting to fall in love with Jesus or God or whatever word you want to put on that. One of the things you said was unconditional love, and you're a pretty loving person, and I'm wondering how you've connected those things now, or if there's something you can speak to around that.
Well, something I've thought about a lot is that, like, to some extent, I think, at least in my experience, I kind of created the God that I needed my parents to be, if that makes sense. Like, I filled in some of the maybe like emotional gap between me and my parents by creating this like ideal being who like knew me completely and loved me totally. I don't know. I mean, certainly I spent a lot of time in my life trying really hard to love everyone I met. And I'm actually really grateful that I had that like orientation for so long. But it's something that just doesn't feel like it's part of my motivation anymore. So I don't know. Maybe it's a habit that just stuck.
It's a good habit.
Yeah, that would be my question. Of what parts of this do you think you still have, and what parts do you reject?
Totally.
Right? I mean, you know, some of it's indelible.
Yeah, I think the social justice concept is still like really, really important to me. Obviously, I'm still an educator, so like the whole, you know, education for social change and bringing about the kingdom of God thing. Just I don't have the kingdom of God part anymore, but yeah, my career basically is founded on the fact that like this was something I believed I was called to do. And then I think like I don't know. There's something around like taking the world seriously in some way, or like being present to things that I think I honed that skill as well. Like paying attention to the conditions of life. I don't know. I saw like 4 people. Russell, start off with you.
So I know a lot of atheists that used to be Catholics. And almost all of them are really angry about having been Catholics. Right? It is not that they identify as being humanists but they have this anger, and you don't.
Yeah, you don't.
Why don't you? And how do I
This
get?
doesn't seem like it was about the Catholic Church.
And how
No, it totally wasn't.
and how do I get them to be more like you, rather than still having a good portion of their life 20 years later caught up in this anger for having been a Catholic before?
So I think there's 2 things there, neither of which is necessarily transmissible to anyone else. One is that the form, or the Catholic circles I used to be part of were the very liberal, like, liberation theology. I attended a Catholic church for LGBT people for a long time, so like I was on the very kind of left end of the spectrum, which means to some extent I didn't have the same like authoritarian, you know, this is what the Pope says and we have to do it kind of streak in a lot of the experiences I had. And then number 2, like Carrie Lynn said, like it wasn't about the Catholic Church for me, right? If I still were a believer, I'd probably still consider myself a Catholic. It's just that, and in fact, I kind of wish I could, right? Because Pope Francis is freaking cool. Like, there's a part of me that's like, oh man, I kind of like to claim that.
He'd let you.
He's cool about it. He'd be cool about it.
I feel weird about it. Yeah, so I think just the way that I experienced it, I think, is not an anger-inducing way. And I would say also, like, I was kind of insulated to some extent by my mom, who also attended the LGBT Catholic group, and also was like a very social justice oriented type of person. So I kind of took her values for my own to some extent. Yes.
So your response to the first question really hit home with me, and some psychologists call God as kind of like the perfect parent, right? So perfect in the sense like you were talking about, you want to achieve perfection in union with that God, and also God doesn't die, right? And so that's, I can see that, from my grief point of view, like this is very comforting on a deep emotional level. What kind of defining experiences do you feel like that you had that that really caused you to question? Was it a philosophical disagreement, or was it a more on an emotional level that you began to sort of drift?
I mean, it always was about a relationship for me, so I feel like it more was an emotional thing. I think the way, and this is like maybe getting super personal, but the way that I tend to grieve, or one of the ways that I grieve is to feel kind of responsible for, or feel like the advocate of the person I've lost. And so, in a way, like, I think, like, my mom was 57, like, that's pretty young, and she didn't really get to, live out all of the things she wanted to live out, right? She didn't get to see her granddaughter, she didn't get to be part of my marriage, like, all of those things. And so, there's a part of me that's kind of like, well, that's really unfair. And if I had just sort of like cozied up to God and was like, hey, like it's all good, like I guess that happened for a reason, like then it almost feels like I'm kind of betraying her, right? Like I'm saying like, oh yeah, it's fine, God, like whatever. And so I think if I think about it as like, would I want to go back? I'm kind of like, no, I'm sort of like angry at that, not at that person, because I don't necessarily think there's a person there to be angry at. But I'm almost like angry at that whole worldview. It's like it doesn't seem right to me to say like on somebody else's behalf, like, oh yeah, it's okay, that happened. It's like I don't accept that. It's just chance, and I prefer to live in a universe where that's just chance and it happens.
And a God that's wrathful, God caused the earthquake, God caused the, it's like, what?
Well, but there's many different mythologies, right? So,
right.
That's just one of them.
And that was never part of how I viewed God either. I mean, but at the same time, it was like, well, then how do I reconcile all of these things? If this thing happened, then on some like profound level, then God doesn't actually have my back.
This is really interesting, Jane. I've been an atheist since birth, so I'm glad you came my way. And I'm wondering, actually, how do you perceive people who are still very strong believers, and can you still relate to them and their experience in the same way as before, or differently, or just not at all, and like there's been this break?
Yeah, that's fascinating. I don't know. I think I would have said, probably 5 years ago, I would have said, yeah, I can still relate. I think now, where I'm at is a little more like, it feels like a foreign country to me now. Or like a language that I forgot how to speak. And it's not something that I can really get in touch with anymore. Although I do still have dreams about God occasionally. Like I'll have a dream and wake up from a dream where like suddenly I have my faith back.
And then Chris shakes you back to reality.
Or well, I wake up and go, oh right, yeah, but there's good reasons that that's not who I am anymore. But I mean, it's just like having a dream about somebody I've lost. Like it's a similar. It feels like a similar experience. I think we might have last one.
Oh, so you'd mentioned having the perspective to look at your actions and say, hey, I think some of these are unproductive. And I'm curious about how you feel like you've redirected that energy, and if you want to speak to the behaviors you felt like were unproductive, but more, how have you rechanneled that?
Sure. So I think, like I put a lot of pressure on myself when I was a believer. Like if I went to a movie that was like, well, maybe I should be spending this time working for social justice. Like it was like, I didn't give myself a lot of leeway to be having a bad day, or I didn't give myself a lot of leeway to like just want to take a nap, you know? So I think, I don't know if that's even something I had to like redirect so much as just sort of go, oh, you know what? It's okay for me to enjoy myself sometimes. And like, I am contributing to the world in all of these different ways. And I'm not only here for that, I'm also here to have fun. Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool. Thank you, bye.